There once were two cats of Kilkenny. Each thought there was one cat too many. So they fought, and they fit, and they scratched, and they bit, till accepting their nails and the tips of their tails, instead of two cats there weren't any.
I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Cara Santa Maria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked
Mormonism,
the serial Mormon history podcast. By late 1843, Joseph Smith had had over 24 run-ins with the law that historians can document. There's at least one known court appearance that happened in the 1820s before the Book of Mormon was published and he became a Mormon prophet and everything, but that's a court appearance that historians don't know the details of, as those details and the documents behind it seem to have been lost to history. It wasn't until the late Kirtland era that Joe ever had legal counsel for court appearances, and that's because Joe was poor, and the idea of like a public defender or something like that wouldn't be created for another half century after his lifetime. It was another 40 years after that when the Sixth Amendment of the Constitution would be interpreted to include competent legal counsel for any capital criminal case, and that was in the case Powell v. Alabama, Supreme Court decision. In Powell v. Alabama, it's a 1931 case, 9 young men of color were accused of raping 2 young white women. These young men came to be known as the Scottsboro Boys. Now, these boys didn't have the resources to hire an attorney because, well, they were young black men in the 1930s, and they weren't appointed any counsel by the judge. So instead, the Scottsboro Boys were represented by a real estate agent and some old guy that hadn't practiced law in like 20 years. All but one of these boys was sentenced to death. They appealed their case, and the Alabama Supreme Court upheld the ruling. Imagine that. It's Alabama. They appealed again, and it went to the Supreme Court. The case at the Supreme Court was overruled, and the conviction was overturned because A, there was no evidence that it had ever occurred, and B, the legal counsel that they had wasn't considered proper or competent, which tainted the outcome of the original hearing. So in this 1931 decision, the Supreme Court ruled that under the 14th Amendment, federal and state governments are required to appoint competent legal counsel to those who are unable to afford it. This was narrow in that it only required competent legal counsel to be appointed in capital criminal cases, but later cases in decades subsequent would continue to expand the ability of defendants to acquire a public defender. Finally, in Gideon v. Wainwright, this is a 1963 decision that any lawyer worth their salt should be able to recite by heart. The definition of competent legal counsel was expanded to all legal matters. Justice Black authored the Supreme Court's opinion, lamenting the fact that, quote, even the intelligent and educated layman has small and sometimes no skill in the science of law. If charged with crime, he is incapable generally of determining for himself whether the indictment is good or bad. He is unfamiliar with the rules of evidence. He requires the guiding hand of counsel at every step in the proceedings against him. Without it, though he be not guilty, he faces the danger of conviction because he does not know how to establish his innocence. End quote. So the idea of a public defender long pre-existed Gideon versus Wainwright in 1963. It was first conceived of by Clara Shortridge Foltz, who was California's first female attorney. She wrote about it extensively in the 1890s and then presented on the subject of a public defender at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. The first public defender's office was officially opened in 1913 in Los Angeles, and then 7 years later, the ACLU was formed as a nonprofit organization defending people's rights, and often, done pro bono. So the sphere of law in the mid-19th century was enormously less complex than it is today, right? In Joe's days, attorneys often just roamed from town to town, taking up cases as they pleased and camping out in the wilderness and whatnot, kind of like stonemasons in medieval Europe. There were guns for hire. The current governor of Illinois in our historical timeline, Thomas Ford, he was one of these roaming attorneys. Abraham Lincoln was even a roaming attorney before he entered into government. These roaming bands of attorneys would go wherever work called them. But it was always a dice roll when a person chose to hire one of these attorneys. The American Bar Association wasn't even created until 1878. So basically anybody could say, there were some state bar associations and stuff, but basically anybody could say, I'm a lawyer now, and they would hire out for cases. So law firms did exist, but they were only accessible to the wealthy. The right to legal counsel granted by the Sixth Amendment wasn't really a right so much as it was a luxury for the wealthy in the 19th century. So for the majority of Joseph Smith's career in the Kirtland era of the church, he was never wealthy enough to afford legal counsel, or he maybe just deemed the expense unnecessary. However, during the 1838 Mormon War in Missouri, Joe's offenses were capital, and he acquired legal counsel in Alexander Doniphan, who was one of the few Missouri government officials and militia officers who was friendly to the Mormons in Missouri. Here, in this 1838 court of inquiry, Joe saw the power that was held by attorneys. Not only did Joe escape total conviction, but Doniphan even negotiated the venue change that created the window necessary for Joe and his buddies to escape from state custody and flee to Illinois. During the Nauvoo era, though, Joe would keep himself on the right side of the law by surrounding himself with powerful politicians, often with extensive knowledge of the legal system and court relationships with, important justices who could navigate the law in a way that favored the Mormons. Judge Stephen A. Douglas, later presidential candidate who was running against Abraham Lincoln, became very intimate with Joe and the Mormon elites. Josiah Butterfield was an attorney by trade and had been a member of the church since 1833. Butterfield was appointed as president of the Quorum of the 70 and even represented Joseph Smith in multiple legal cases. Joe acquired a posse of attorneys around him because, not only was he beginning to recognize the power that was held by attorneys, but he was becoming quite attuned to the general power of the legal system in general when it was handled delicately by expert hands. Joe's greatest legal troubles were beginning to catch up with him by 1843. He had multiple outstanding warrants for his arrest in June from governors of multiple states. He was a fugitive from justice of the state of Missouri, from all of the old Missouri Mormon War charges of arson, robbery, high treason. He was accused of collusion with Pistol Pack and Porter Rockwell in attempting to assassinate former governor of Missouri, Lilburn Boggs. And, there were just a lot of things that were piling up. And Joe and Port had even been arrested in late 1842, but they were left with the Nauvoo constable, and after that, they weren't to be found, right? Port fled to Pittsburgh while Joe remained in hiding in Nauvoo and the surrounding Mormon cities for months from that time forward. Eventually, Joe gave himself up for arrest by Wilson Law, who was then, a powerful Mormon elite, a major general of the Nauvoo Legion, and a member of the Nauvoo City Council. Now, this is when Joe and his posse of some 100 dudes, a sour lot of Danites and ruffians, they made their way to Springfield, Illinois, where Judge Pope honored the latest iteration of their writ of habeas corpus, and Joe was allowed to go free. Episode 136 is where you're going to find all the details of this whole hearing and everything that led up to it, where Josiah Butterfield actually represented Joseph Smith. So Joe remained safe, from legally speaking anyway, for a short while throughout the first half of 1843. Then, as Joseph was visiting some of Emma's family in Dixon, Illinois, Sheriffs Reynolds and Wilson, acting on warrants for arrest and extradition issued by Governors Reynolds of Missouri and Ford of Illinois, arrested Joseph Smith. Episode 144 through 147, those are the episodes that you have to go back to. That goes through the entire week that Joe was arrested and all of the legal troubles that were created by this chaos. When Joe was first arrested, however, he had learned from his previous dozens of legal troubles and decided that acquiring a powerful and well-known lawyer as soon as possible would bode well for his long-term legal well-being. As soon as Joe was arrested, he didn't know what to expect, right? He thought, reasonably so, that he was going to be extradited to Missouri, which in Missouri, the gallows awaited him, right? He had no idea if his Danites would find him or not, but he knew that if he was taken over the state line into Missouri, his life was over. So what did Joe do? Well, he sent a messenger to the nearest lawyer who could accompany him while in the custody of Sheriffs Reynolds and Wilson. Two lawyers were first petitioned to help Joe, Edward Southwick and Shepard G. Patrick. Both of these guys had the door literally slammed in their face by the sheriffs when they tried to meet with their client. Joe had sent his scribe, William Clayton, on a steamer to Nauvoo in order to tell Hyrum Sidekick-Abiff Smith about Joe's arrest, and then that's when Hyrum Smith sent out all of the Danites. But then another messenger at the same time was dispatched to find a man with a large legal name in legal spheres and nearly 3 decades of the legal trade under his belt and suspenders, Cyrus Walker. Cyrus Walker had been a law partner with Josephus Hewitt and James Conkling after he had served 2 terms in the Kentucky legislature, after he had been an attorney there in Kentucky for about a decade. This guy, Cyrus Walker, was one of those lawyers with a huge name who'd gone through the revolving door of law and government a few times when he was approached by a messenger on behalf of Joseph Smith. When the messenger told Cyrus Walker who wanted to hire him and for what purpose, Walker's response was predictable, as he was currently attempting to walk again through that same political revolving door. Walker was out electioneering for himself to become a member of the Illinois State House of Representatives. But the messenger, Stephen Markham, offered Walker something, he really couldn't refuse: the Mormon voting bloc. This is from the History of the Church, Dan Vogel edition, volume 5, page 471. Quote, Mr. Cyrus Walker, who was out electioneering to become the representative for Congress, told me that he could not find time to be my lawyer unless I would promise him my vote. He being considered the greatest criminal lawyer in that part of Illinois, I determined to secure his aid and promised him my vote. He afterwards went to Markham and joyfully said, I am now sure of my election, as Joseph Smith has promised me his vote, and I am going to defend him. End quote. And he was. Cyrus Walker knew that now he could stop electioneering for himself, and he could devote all of his time and attention to Joseph Smith's legal affairs, which he would for the rest of 1843. And, of course, he'd still be elected, right? What could possibly go wrong? Walker was running as the Whig candidate during the death throes of the Whig Party. Walker, along with everybody else, could feel the waning power of the Whig Party, which made the future of the party and any of its candidates rather uncertain. However, any candidate who could curry the Mormon vote in Illinois had their election made sure, regardless of their party. The Mormons didn't vote as a party, they voted as a bloc for whoever Joe told them to vote for. Now, Cyrus Walker, this isn't the first time that he had been petitioned by Joseph Smith to represent him. He had been Joe's legal counsel back in 1841 when Joe was briefly arrested, but that case was quickly forgotten upon the issuance of a writ of habeas corpus by, of course, the Nauvoo city government. So Walker and Joe had forged, some kind of a professional working relationship during that case. They likely had some level of mutual respect for one another. So when Joe offered the Mormon vote to Walker had every reason to believe that taking this one case would land him in Illinois' 6th District, which included the Mormon-controlled Hancock County, where he was electioneering. Now, the Democrats had taken the Mormon vote for the 1841 election, which put Thomas Ford on the governor's seat for 1842. The reason why is the Whig candidate for that election in 1841 that resulted, the gubernatorial election, the Whig candidate was named Joseph Duncan. Joseph Duncan had sworn that he would revoke the Nauvoo charter, and, well, as a result, that was Mormon persecution, right? So eventually Thomas Ford won the gubernatorial election with the Mormon swing voting bloc. A little side note here, Joseph Smith even named his favorite horse Joe Duncan, the name of that Whig candidate who swore that he would revoke the Nauvoo charter, so that Joe could literally whip his greatest political adversary when he was riding off into the night to build the kingdom of God or something like that, right? So that meant that unless there were any extenuating circumstances, which those happen all the time in Nauvoo history, right? In early 1843, the Democrats essentially considered Hancock County and the Mormon voting bloc within it to be the most crucial swing vote in their district. However, with Cyrus Walker, the most prominent and promising Whig candidate, representing Joseph Smith in a very public and exciting hearing that held the prophet's life in the balance, the Democrats likely would have considered the Mormons to have swung towards the Whigs, right? Joe coming out explicitly and telling the Mormons in public settings that Walker had Joe's vote, that was enough of a signal to the Democrats that they had lost the Mormon voting bloc in the election of 1843. But Walker was amidst campaigning for his own election when he signed on to defend Joe, and the Democrats were amidst campaigning their own around Illinois, their own candidate. The Democrats nominated a guy named Joseph P. Hoge to run against Cyrus Walker. Now, both of these men were described in Gregg's 1880 History of Hancock County as follows from page 291, quote, "The two candidates were representative men of their respective parties and personally popular. Mr. Walker was an old lawyer of distinction in the state and regarded as the peer of the leading lawyers at the capital. Hoge was a younger and newer man, but was talented, energetic, and a good stump speaker. He had never been in any way identified with the Mormons, residing in a county remote from them in the district. Walker was supposed to be in good favor with them and had once or twice acted as counsel for the prophet." End quote. Now, let's consider this in the abstract a little bit here. There was a limitation of campaigning in 19th century America. That was the vast distances of a state such as Illinois and the complete lack of proper rail infrastructure to cover those distances. Campaigning for election in any office was a months-long endeavor of riding on horseback from town to town, making frequent appearances, holding rallies, speaking to voters, and, of course, knocking on doors. Gregg summarizes how tough this was, along with a general assessment of the political landscape of Illinois at the time. Once again, this is from the History of Hancock County, circa 1880, quote, "Soon after the nominations of Hoge and Walker, the campaign of the district began with great vigor. To make a thorough canvass in so large a district, it required a great deal of time and a great amount of physical energy, it being necessary to address the people in at least 3 or 4, and often 8 to 10 places in a county. Irrespective of the Mormon vote, there was a deciding Whig majority in the district, and the probabilities were strongly in favor of the success of the Whig candidate." End quote. So, let's try and step into Cyrus Walker's shoes here. You're Cyrus Walker. You're well known. You're highly respected as a past politician and an extremely adept lawyer. You're campaigning as the Whig candidate in a Whig majority district in a Whig state that happens to have a Democrat governor. Now, whether or not you choose to defend Joe in this very controversial case will likely have an interesting and unpredictable effect on your campaign. What it certainly did was make for a ton of publicity, and that publicity was achieved with less time on horseback, electioneering, holding rallies, eating terrible tavern food, and knocking on doors, and explicitly asking for people's votes. So, I mean, if I were Cyrus Walker, I would take that deal, wouldn't you? I mean, you have the decision of riding for hours a day on horseback, staying at taverns, talking to thousands of strangers, and making vacuous promises. Or you have that juxtaposed with being one dude's legal counsel who'd been your client before, and that's instead through that venue, that's where you get all of the necessary publicity from that issue to make sure that you get elected. Which one do you choose, especially in an already safe election in a Whig state like this one? Now, there were a few issues that divided candidates and therefore distinguished voters apart from each other, right? Most notably, slavery. That was a big issue in the 1840s. The annexation of Texas, as well as, slave laws in newly annexed territories, that was a big issue. American expansionism and the plight of the Native Americans, national banks, there are a few other smaller issues, but these are some of the big ticket items that candidates incorporated into their platform. But Walker now incorporated a new issue into his platform when he took on Joe's case: Mormon rights, which was a rather divisive issue as well. So when the posse of the sheriffs who had arrested the prophet, Joe, and along with his newly acquired legal counsel, Cyrus Walker, and a big group of Danites, all of them made it to Nauvoo, Walker made an incredible speech on behalf of Joseph Smith and the expansive rights of the Nauvoo city government. This is once again from Gregg's 1880 History of Hancock. Quote, "When Smith was arrested, it so happened that both Walker and Hoge, the Democrat candidate, were in a vicinity of Dixon canvassing the district. In addition to the 2 Dixon attorneys, Smith sent for and engaged Walker. This gentleman left his appointments and, as we have seen, rode with the cavalcade to Nauvoo, and it is said there made a 3 hours speech in favor of Smith's discharge by the municipal court and contending for its jurisdiction." End quote. But Cyrus Walker, out there campaigning for Mormon rights and taking Joseph Smith as his next client, he was not to be outdone by his political opponent only a month before the election, right? The Democratic candidate, Joseph Hoge, also made Mormon rights part of his campaign. Thus we see just how Joe was able to realize and throw around his political capital in this contested election. Hoge traveled to Nauvoo around the same time and made a similar speech with regards to the expansive power of the Nauvoo Charter rights. Quote, Governor Ford in his history states that both he, Cyrus Walker, and Hoge from the public stand in Nauvoo afterwards declared their belief in the existence of the power claimed by the Nauvoo Municipal Court. And that means the powers of habeas corpus that Joe was attempting to exercise here. So, because Cyrus Walker had been so helpful to Joe in all of his legal troubles, Joe took the stand in early July of 1843 while the documents were still being sorted out in the wake of all of the arrests and the hearings and of Joe's release. This is what Joe said from the pulpit while he was pointing to Cyrus Walker, who was seated on the stand from which Joe was preaching. Quote, I have converted this candidate for Congress. The right of habeas corpus is included in our charter. If he continues converted, I will vote for him. End quote. This was a public declaration from the pulpit less than a month before the election that Walker needed in order to ensure that he had the Mormon voting bloc behind him in the coming election. But the speech was far from over. Joe continued the speech with a threat of violence, sending powerful signals to the Mormons in the audience just as much as to Walker and any other politician or reporter who may be attending or receive a transcript of this speech. Quote, There is nothing but what we have power over, except we're restricted by the Constitution of the United States. The Constitution of the United States declares that the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be denied. Deny me the writ of habeas corpus, and I will fight with gun, sword, cannon, whirlwind, and thunder until they are used up like the Kilkenny cats. And the great Elohim has given me the privilege of having the benefits of the Constitution and the writ of habeas corpus. And I am bold to ask for this privilege this day, and I ask, in the name of Jesus Christ and all that is sacred, that I may have your lives and all your energies to carry out the freedom which is chartered to us. Then he cast a vote to the audience with these words, Will you help me? If so, make it manifest by raising the right hand. End quote. Then everybody, of course, shouted and cheered with uplifted hands in support of Joe, the Mormon Muhammad. As the crowd cheered, Joe turned toward Cyrus Walker and spoke just loud enough for the recorder on the stand to hear, but to escape the audience. Quote, These are the greatest dupes as a body of people that ever lived, or else I am not so big a rogue as I am reported to be. End quote. As the crowd quieted down from this very emotive speech, he gestured towards Cyrus Walker and announced to the crowd a statement that has become infamous in Mormon circles when talking about Cyrus Walker and Joseph Smith's involvement in law and politics. Quote, I understand the gospel, and you do not, pointing at Cyrus Walker. You understand the quackery of law, and I do not. End quote. It's an interesting speech, but Hoge and Walker openly competing for Mormon rights turned the 1843 election into a race to the bottom of making expansive and un-American promises to the Mormon theocracy and to its leader. Both Walker and Hoge made their promises to uphold religious liberty in the face of Missouri trying to persecute and, extradite the prophet to finally hold him accountable for the conflict there in 1838. But Joe had made a promise to Cyrus Walker that he would have his vote, implying that Walker and the Whigs would have the entire Mormon voting bloc. But Joe made that promise when he was in dire straits, under arrest of 2 sheriffs with proper documentation to extradite him to Missouri. And we know that Joe would make all sorts of promises when his life was in danger. But when it came time to uphold those promises, could he be counted on? So how did all of this play out? Well, Cyrus Walker became the Whig liaison to the Mormons in order to ensure their vote, but the Democrats held the state governor's office, and Illinois was slowly shifting from yellow Whig to blue Democrat as the Whig party was, dying a slow and painful death. Thomas Ford wasn't necessarily a friend of the Mormons, but throughout this entire fiasco of Joe's June 1843 arrest, Governor Thomas Ford simply let the issue die. He he just counted the issue as handled. He'd done everything that he had planned on doing to get Joe extradited to Missouri, and it didn't work. So he had fulfilled the promises and duties of his office, and the issue just sort of fell away. However, this meant that Ford and the Democrats seeking election in 1843 held leverage over the Mormons because the issue was still very volatile in the minds of the Illinois Gentiles and the anti-Mormons, and it was a huge issue for Missouri Democrats who wanted Joe's head on a pike. This August 1843 election was coming a mere month after that habeas corpus issue was settled in the Nauvoo courts. The issue of whether or not Joe would be forcefully taken to Missouri at the hands of an Illinois militia, that was still vivid and unresolved in the minds of thousands of people, Joseph Smith included. It was viewed by the public that the Democrats had been responsible for Joe's arrest and near extradition. Missouri was a deeply blue-blooded Jacksonian Democratic state, seeing their neighbors to the north, Illinois, as the hoity-toity Whigs, right? Thomas Ford summarizes the political state of affairs in his History of Illinois. This is beginning on page 314. Quote, "Upon this proceeding, the Whigs founded a hope of obtaining the future support of the Mormons. The Democratic officers in Missouri and Illinois were instrumental in procuring his arrest. He was discharged this time by a Whig judge, and his cause had been managed by Whig lawyers. As in the case decided by Judge Douglas, Smith was too ignorant of law to know whether he owed his discharge to the law or to the favor of the court in the Whig party. Such was the ignorance and stupidity of the Mormons generally, that they deemed anything to be law which they judged to be expedient. All action of the government which bore hard on them, however legal, they looked upon as wantonly oppressive, and when the law was administered in their favor, they attributed it to partiality and kindness. If the stern duty of a public officer required him to bear hard on them, they attributed it to malice. In this manner, the Mormons this time were made to believe that they were under great obligations to the Whigs for the discharge of their prophet, from what they believed to be the persecutions of the Democrats, and they resolved to yield their support to the Whig party in the next election." End quote. What Ford is saying here is that the Mormons owed a political favor to Walker and to the Whigs for Joe's escape from the gallows this time, right? He'd escaped many times before. Not only had Joe declared publicly that he would vote for Walker in the next election, but the idea of Whig support had infected the blood of the Mormon populace. The states of Illinois and Missouri had Democrat governors to execute the laws and the constitution of the land, and were therefore seen as solely responsible for carrying out the criminal convictions of Joseph Smith. Now, Walker, like many other politicians, had found how he could be useful to the Mormons, and he fulfilled that use. When the Nauvoo court released Joseph Smith from this June of 1843 arrest, Sheriff Reynolds sought a meeting with Governor Ford in order to call out the Illinois militia and march them into Nauvoo. However, Cyrus Walker was hot on Sheriff Reynolds' tail to attempt to persuade Governor Ford the other direction. This is how Ford reports it in his History of Illinois. Quote, "The Missouri agent immediately applied to me for a militia force to renew it," the arrest warrant, "and Mr. Walker came to the seat of the government on the part of the Mormons to resist the application. This was only a short time before the election. I was indisposed from the first to call out the militia and inform Mr. Walker that my best opinion then was that the militia would not be ordered. But as many important questions of law were involved in the decision, I declined then to pronounce a definite opinion." End quote. Thomas Ford was the Democrat governor. This was a bargaining chip. After this meeting with the governor, Cyrus Walker returned to Nauvoo to report to Joseph Smith that Governor Ford probably wouldn't be calling out the militia, but he couldn't get his word. This meant that Walker's use had been fulfilled to Joe and the Mormons. But the looming threat of Jacksonian Democrats pursuing further action by law still hung over Joe and the Mormons' heads. What were Joe and the Mormons to do? What were Illinois politicians to do with the entire Mormon voting bloc still up for grabs only a month away from an important election when the votes were already publicly sworn to Walker? Could Joe and the Mormons be persuaded to change party fealty with a carrot and stick approach? This is what the Democrats did, once again, from Thomas Ford's History of Illinois. Quote, However, the Democratic managers about Nauvoo, after the usual fashion of managing the Mormons by both parties, terrified them if they voted for the Whig candidate, as they were yet determined with the prospect of the militia being sent against them. Like I said, calling out the Illinois militia and marching them into Nauvoo to arrest Joseph Smith, this was a real threat, and it was a bargaining chip that Thomas Ford had. Continuing. Backenstoss, a managing Democrat of Hancock County, was sent as a messenger to Springfield to ascertain positively what the governor would do if the Mormons voted the Democratic ticket. I happened to be absent at St. Louis, but I heard some weeks after the election that Backenstoss went home pretending that he had the most ample assurances of favors to the Mormons, so long as they voted the Democratic ticket. And I was informed by the man himself, a prominent Democrat of Springfield, that during my absence, he had given a positive pledge in my name to Backenstoss that if the Mormons voted the Democratic ticket, the militia should not be sent against them. Backenstoss returned only a day or two before the election, and there was only a short time for the leaders to operate in. End quote. Election day was 2 days away. Walker had been publicly declared from the pulpit to be the Mormon horse in the race. Joe had sworn multiple times in public that he would vote for the Whig candidate, Cyrus Walker, but now there was new information to deal with. Jacob Backenstoss came to Nauvoo and told Joe that he had it on good authority that the Democrats wouldn't call out the militia as long as they got the Mormon vote, implying the inverse to be true as well. And Backenstoss had been given that information by somebody from Governor Ford's own office, while Governor Ford was absent in St. Louis on business. So, Walker had served his purpose to the Mormons. He held up his end of the bargain. He called off his electioneering campaign with the handshake agreement with Joseph Smith that he would get the Mormon voting bloc in a state with a Democratic governor, but largely run by Whigs in lower elected offices. Now, the looming threat of the militia marching into Nauvoo, just like 5 years ago in Far West and Adamant, could be completely done away with if Joe just somehow got the Mormons as a bloc to vote Democrat. How would Joe handle this without going back on his word with Cyrus Walker? How could he do this while not admitting that he was wrong and then getting all the Mormons to vote Democrat instead of Whig, like he had prepped them to do for over a month now? The day Backenstoss returned, August 6, 1843, 2 days before the election, a public meeting was called in Nauvoo. Joe took the stand, with Whiteout Willard Richards sitting on the stand recording what he was saying. Now, this was recorded quickly as Joe was speaking in real time, so it doesn't make much sense if I read the original source document from the Joseph Smith papers, but needless to say, you'll still find a link to it in the show notes, the actual source documentation. Instead, I'm going to read it from the History of the Church, Volume 5, where Willard Richards expanded his notes from that source document into the full-on sermon and adding and editorializing as he saw fit, because he's Whiteout Willard Richards. He's one of the chief propaganda officers of the church. This is what Joseph said from the pulpit 2 days before election. Quote, "I am above the kingdoms of the world, for I have no laws. I am not come to tell you to vote this way, that way, or the other. In relation to national matters, I wanted to go abroad unto the whole world, that every man should stand on his own merits. The Lord has not given me a revelation concerning politics. I have not asked him for one. I am a third party and stand independent and alone. I desire to see all parties protected in their rights. As for Mr. Walker, he is a Whig candidate, a high-minded man. He has not hung on to my coat-tail to gain his election, as some have said. I mean, yeah, Mr. Walker, Cyrus Walker, totally did hang on to the coattails of Joseph Smith, because Joseph Smith promised him that if he would do him this favor, that Joe would do Walker the favor of voting for him, which implied the entire Mormon voting bloc, right? Okay, whatever. Still, continuing. I'm going to give a testimony, but not for electioneering purposes. Before Mr. Walker came to Nauvoo, rumor came up that he might become a candidate for Congress. No, it wasn't a rumor. Joe, you literally pulled him away from his campaign. He was electioneering for himself with your promise to vote for him. It wasn't a rumor. It was fact. He knew it. Everybody knew it. He was electioneering. Okay, whatever. Anyway. Said I, he is an old friend, and I'll vote for him. When he came to my house, I voluntarily told him I should vote for him. When I made him acquainted with the ordinances of Nauvoo in relation to the writs of habeas corpus, he acted in accordance therewith on my testimony. The rascals, that's Sheriff Reynolds, Sheriff Wilson, took Walker's and Montgomery's security when I was arrested. Walker made Reynolds come to me and beg my pardon for the abuse he gave me, and through his means and influence the pistols were taken from the rascals. He withdrew all claim to your vote and influence if it would be detrimental to your interest as a people." End quote. Now, here is the important part of this sermon, happening 2 days before the election. Like I said, Joe had been prepping the Mormons for a month by this point to vote for the Whig candidate, Cyrus Walker. This is what Joseph Smith said 2 days before election. Quote, "Brother Hyrum tells me this morning that he had had a testimony to the effect it would be better for the people to vote for Hoge, and I never," that's the Democrat, "and I never knew Hyrum to say he ever had a revelation and it failed. I authorize all men to say I am a personal friend of Governor Ford." End quote. The Democrat, Governor Ford. Brother Hyrum says that he had a testimony that the people should vote for Hoge, and he never knew Hyrum had a revelation that failed. But this meeting wasn't over just yet. After Joe stepped down from the pulpit, the podium, whatever you want to call it, Hyrum Sidekick-Abiff himself took the stand and expounded on the revelation that he received the night before. No record survives of what Hyrum Smith said specifically, but after Hyrum finished, William Law, one of the highest-ranking Nauvoo elites, took the stand in an epic display of insubordination that foreshadows events laying on our distant historical horizon. Back to Thomas Ford's History of Illinois. Quote, "William Law, another great leader of the Mormons, next appeared and denied that the Lord had made any such revelation to Hyrum Smith. He stated that, to his certain knowledge, the prophet Joseph was in favor of Mr. Walker, and that the prophet was more likely to know the mind of the Lord on the subject than the patriarch." End quote. Hyrum took the stand again to respond to what William Law had just said about Joe being in favor of Cyrus Walker, and, quote, repeated his revelation with greater tone of authority, end quote. And then, after Hyrum Smith stepped down, Joe took the stand again to clear the air. Quote, "Joe Smith there stated that he himself was in favor of Mr. Walker and intended to vote for him, that he would not, if he could, influence any voter in giving his vote, that he considered it a mean business for him or any other man to attempt to dictate to the people who they should support in elections, that he had heard his brother Hyrum had received a revelation from the Lord on the subject. Brother Hyrum is a man of truth. He had known his brother Hyrum intimately ever since he was a boy, and he had never known him to tell a lie. If Brother Hyrum said he had received such a revelation, he had no doubt it was a fact. When the Lord speaks, let all the earth be silent." End quote. Now from Gregg's History of Hancock County, quote, "That settled it. The election occurred on the next day. It is believed the prophet did, with a few others, vote for Walker in the face of the revelation, but the body of his followers voted for Hoge, giving him 2,088 votes to Walker's 733 in the county, and beating him in the district by 455 votes. This change of position at Nauvoo was not known in Adams County till after the election, so Mr. O.H. Browning, the Whig candidate in that district, received the Mormon vote there." End quote. I mean, this was a speech 2 days before Election Day. Word hadn't traveled all the way to Adams County by this time, and the Mormons there voted Whig, just like Joseph Smith had been prepping the Mormons in all of Illinois to be voting Whig for the entire month prior. 455 votes. 455 votes. The fact that Cyrus Walker put his electioneering campaign on hold to defend Joseph Smith against his capital offense criminal allegations and therefore wasn't able to campaign effectively, that fact didn't escape him or the Whig Party as a whole. You see, had Cyrus Walker turned down Joe's request to be his legal counsel, Walker could have continued his campaign and secured the election in the Whig state of Illinois and never would have lost by less than 500 votes. Thomas Gregg comments on this lost opportunity for Walker and the Whigs as follows, quote, "To Mr. Walker and his friends, and the Whig Party generally, the result was the more aggravating from the fact that it was made quite evident that by a straightforward, honest, and independent course, thus securing a full and enthusiastic Whig support, Walker could have been elected with the Mormon vote solid against him," end quote. And that is absolutely true, right? If the Mormons had simply abstained from the election, Walker would have won by a landslide, by a huge margin. Instead, because Walker put his campaign on hold and this little flip-flop that Joe and his friends did, Hoge, the Democrat without a snowball's chance in hell in a Whig state, took the election in a major swing vote victory. If Walker had continued electioneering for the rest of July and all the way into early August 1843, he could have rallied up the Whig voters, gotten them to the polls, and won even if the Mormons had voted Democrat. But because he put his campaign on hold, he lost by less than 500 votes. See, this illustrates the Mormons were a massive swing vote, but Hancock County was a solid Whig county. This was a dirty little trick for Joe and Hyrum to play, but at least it worked for like the whole 9 months until they were assassinated, right? Governor Thomas Ford opines on how the Whig politicians and the Whig papers had softened their vitriol against the Mormons in 1843 in hopes of getting the Mormon vote, but renewed their media assassinations of Joe and the Mormons once they realized exactly what had happened. Quote, "The result of the election struck the Whigs with perfect amazement. Whilst they fancied themselves secure of getting the Mormon vote for Mr. Walker, the Whig newspapers had entirely ceased their accustomed abuse of the Mormons. They now renewed their crusade against them. Every paper was loaded with accounts of the wickedness, corruptions, and enormities of Nauvoo. The Whig orators groaned with complaints and denunciations of the Democrats who would consent to receive Mormon support, and the Democratic officers of the state were violently charged and assaulted with using the influence of their offices to govern the Mormons. From this time forth, the Whigs generally, and part on the Democrats, determined upon driving the Mormons out of the state, and everything connected with the Mormons became political and was considered almost entirely with reference to party." End quote. This renewed fervor against the Mormons ignited a media firestorm, and the Mormons would deal with that for the remainder of their time in the state of Illinois. And also, we can't ignore that the Mormons, in some small part, played a role in the death of the Whig Party. All the way back in episode 77, it was a while back, we talked about a guy named Thomas Coke Sharp. Now, this guy, he's long been absent from our historical timeline, quite a while now anyway, but it's important to bring him up now. Thomas Sharp was one of the founding members of the anti-Mormon political party in early 1840. Thomas Sharp attended the groundbreaking and cornerstone laying ceremony of the Nauvoo Temple, Talos' temple crown, when the Nauvoo Legion was out in full force, armed, uniformed, ready to go, right? Well, Thomas Sharp noticed a major issue when one religious leader had so much power that he could see was only growing, and he took to printing frequently about the Mormons in his paper, The Warsaw Signal. Thomas Sharp earned the hated nickname from Joe's younger brother of Tom Ass Sharp in Crazy Willie's paper called The Wasp that was printed out of Nauvoo. Thomas Sharp was a thorn in the side of the Mormons, and he gave voice to the anti-Mormon political party that was ready to declare all-out war against the chosen people of God. Sharp's Warsaw Signal articles were frequently reprinted in the Quincy Whig and many other newspapers across the country, which fed into the Mormon persecution narrative. But consider the political sphere of 1843 and this hotly contested election. The anti-Mormon political party still existed, but it fell into the background beginning in early 1843 because the Mormon voting bloc was up for grabs by either party that year. This meant that the Whig papers, as Thomas Ford spoke to from the previous quote, were much less harsh on the Mormons. He said they ceased their abuse. The Whig papers didn't want the Mormons to see the Whigs as their enemies if it meant that they could get the Mormon vote. Similarly, the Democrat media was rarely anti-Mormon because there were a lot of Whig Mormons, but they'd vote Democrat, if Joe thought that it would be best for the church. The Democrats didn't want to be seen as anti-Mormon for the same reason the Whigs didn't want to be seen as anti-Mormon. It could cost them crucial votes in this controversial 1843 election. Now, however, the election was over. All those barriers fell away. The Mormons declared their fealty through a complicated mess of political chess, and the Whigs were ready for war. The Democrats had landed the Mormons for this 1843 election, but the hold was tenuous at best, right? The Mormons could always flip right back to Whig at any moment. The Democrats were perceived by Mormons to be the party that had chased them out of the deeply blue Democrat state of Missouri. The Democrats had to give Mormons all sorts of favors in order to retain those votes after this heated election, and the next presidential election was just a year in the horizon. However, just a few months after this, Joe did something that nobody could have predicted, whether they were Democrat or Whig. He ran for president. But where did Thomas C. Sharp go for 1843? Now, we've read a number of his articles from the Warsaw Signal on this show since episode 77, but he's been absent for a long time. Well, it turns out in late 1842, the Warsaw Signal came into financial difficulties. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is Thomas Sharp's articles were reprinted nationally. A lot of what fueled the national anti-Mormon sentiments came out of Thomas Sharp because he was a bystander. He was one of the founding members of the anti-Mormon political party that was created for the sole purpose of combating the Mormons' expanding political power. Thomas C. Sharp just simply went away for 1843 because the Warsaw Signal came into financial difficulties in late 42. October 1st, 1842 was the last issue of the Warsaw Signal, owned by Thomas C. Sharp, and on page 2 of that edition, he wrote an obituary for the paper. But the Warsaw Signal was resurrected February 14th, 1844, with a renewed volcanic spewing of editorials about the latest Mormon movements in light of Joe's declaration for president. The first resurrected issue of the Warsaw Signal is amazing. Quote, "In resuming our editorial duties, we feel it incumbent upon us to apprise our readers of the reasons which have propelled us to our present undertaking. Probably, in no portion of the Union is the public mind so violently and dangerously affected as it is at this present time in this vicinity. The Mormons, on the one hand, have a press to defend them and give color in their own favor to whatever transaction may occur between them and their opponents. The old citizens, on the other hand, should have an organ through which to make known to the world their grievances, and to refute the slanders which are weakly emanating from the press of their opponents. Never since the formation of our government did it ever behoove any class of people to stand more firmly together for the protection of each other and each other's rights than the old citizens of this community are called upon to do at this present crisis. In our midst is a dangerous combination, bound together by the power of superstition, led on by one man, and that man a dangerous and aspiring knave, possessing a capacity for secrecy, which enables it to commit any atrocity without fear of detection." End quote. The following issue, February 21st, 1844, is just a gem. And you can trust me, Thomas Sharp and his articles in the Warsaw Signal will continue to occupy an increasing amount of our time moving forward into 1844. Quote, "To Joe Smith, prophet, candidate for the presidency, mayor of the city of Nauvoo, lieutenant general of the Legion, president of the church, tavern keeper, grog bruiser, etc., 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 etc. Sir, understanding that you are a candidate for the highest office within the gift of the people, we claim as the unalienable right of an American citizen to ask you a few questions as regards the policy which you, as His Excellency the President of the United States, will pursue. Well, Joe, if you should be so fortunate to be elected to the President of the United States, what would you do with the state of Missouri? Would you pluck out the eyes of her sovereignty, or would you take her up in your expanded arms and giant-like stride across the western prairies, leap the Rocky Mountains, and hurl her headlong into the angry Pacific, there to remain until purged of every anti-Mormon sin? Or, Joe, would you, Xerxes-like, muster your myriads, and every man armed with a hoop pole march across the icy bridge in the wintertime and give her sovereign highness a most transcendent daubing? From the manner in which you write to John C. Calhoun, we conclude that you had some design of chastising Missouri, and we would like to know how you are going to do it, and so no doubt with the people of that state." End quote. It's heating up a little bit, isn't it? Getting a little toasty. Might need to loosen up the collar, undo the tie a little bit. You see, throughout all of this, Joseph Smith was a man supposedly led by God. He put himself in a position of moral superiority to everybody else on the planet. Now, I get the line that he was a prophet, but he was still a man, and therefore not infallible. Great, that's fine, cool, whatever. But he was also criminally venal and nakedly unscrupulous in everything he did. The position he currently occupies in our timeline is exactly what he was chasing his entire life. Whether it was religiously, politically, socially, or any other angle that we look at this guy, he did what he wanted in life, and 1844 is the culmination of exactly what he aspired to his entire life. Joe was nearing the edge of absolute power, and he was absolutely corrupt. And that's going to do it for the episode today. We have one new patron to thank. We have the new patron, Cirque No Trab. Yes, Trab? No Trab. No, it's No Trab. Cirque No Trab. So thank you so much for pledging to support the show over at patreon.com/nakedmormonism, where listeners who do subscribe over to that feed gain access to a whole bunch of extra content, including extended edition of every new episode. The uncensored variety segment. So if that sounds appealing to you, go check out patreon.com/nakedmormonism and pledge to support the show. For those of you who do, thank you also very much. One more thing. I don't know, I hardly ever talk about this on the show, but we're running on almost a year of Glass Box podcast. Every 2 weeks, Braden and I take on headlines in and out of Mormonism, and there are now 25 episodes up. And I just wanted to let everybody know about this. It's a pretty fun show. We have a good time on there. Braden and I are kind of developing our co-hosting dynamic, and we're really enjoying doing it. And the topics are fun. We're taking on more of a headline approach. And if you enjoyed when I did headline segments in this podcast, that might be one that you want to check out. Glassbox Podcast. It's a project that I think that he and I are both, getting to the point where we can actually be proud of it instead of like, oh, okay, what are we doing? How are we doing this? So it is really encouraging, and we're getting some really positive feedback, especially on our longer form deep dive episodes where we kind of go through the history of a single subject. And it's a lot of fun. And the episodes are not serialized or anything like that. So you know what? Pop over there, subscribe, and download 1 or 2 episodes that look like, based on the title or on the description of the episodes. If they look interesting, give us a shot, give us a listen. And if it sounds good, maybe download the other episodes. If not, hey, what have you lost? A couple hours. Anyway, so that's all we got for you tonight. Of course, thanks to everybody who gets in touch with me at nakedmormonism@gmail.com, or who subscribes and likes on social media, on, of course, your favorite podcasting app of choice, leaves a review. That's super helpful for visibility of the show. But most importantly, thank you to all of you listeners out there who hit download and who listen all the way to the end of the episode. You hit the download button, you're here, you're hanging out, and of course I want to thank you for lending me your ear. Hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast.
Yeah.
This podcast is produced with the help of Julie Briscoe as social media manager, Brian Ziegenhagen as audio engineer, and Andrew Torres of the law offices of P. Andrew Torres in the Opening Arguments podcast as legal counsel. Music is written and performed by Jason Camo of aloststateofmind.com and used with permission. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, copyright 2019, all rights reserved.